there is a thing known to every man who has ever kept a clock against the stars, and to almost no one else alive, that the sky keeps its appointments. It does not keep them a minute early to flatter a great man, nor a minute late to spite a poor one. It has never once, in the whole reckoning of the world, stood still because a duke was waiting, nor come and gone unseen, because the single soul who foretold it was nobody. The sun will cross a particular thread of spider silk stretched in the focus of a glass at a particular second of a particular morning, and it will do that whether the best company in England is gathered to watch it, or whether there is no one awake on the whole dark curve of the earth, but one cold figure at an eyepiece with a candle and a sharpened pencil. And it will do it to the same second for both of them, and it cannot be argued with, and it cannot be bought, and it does not care in the least who is right. Men are not made like this. Men keep the appointments that flatter them and forget the ones that do not. They are late, and are sorry, and are believed anyway if they are grand enough. And knowing this about themselves, long ago they built instruments to hold the moving sky still for a moment and read it off in numbers, so that a thing as slippery as a star might be pinned to a page and trusted after all. The finest of these was a great circle of brass, taller than a man, divided round its whole rim into degrees and the minutes of a degree by the most patient hand that could be hired, and hung upon a wall of solid stone so that it should never stir, and with it a good observer could take the height of a star as it came to the meridian, and write down where the heavens had been, to a nicety that would have shamed a duelist's aim. And here is the whole of what follows, laid down in a single sentence, so that you may carry it with you through everything that comes after. A circle of brass can be wrong. It is cut by a man, and a man's hand grows tired toward the end of a long division, and crowds the strokes a hair together, where the light was bad, and it is warmed on its eastern limb by the morning sun while its western limb stands in shadow, and brass that is warmed grows by a very little, and a very little is a great deal to the stars. And the terrible part is this: the circle will give you its wrong answer in exactly the same confident, elegant, unhesitating voice in which it gives you its right ones. It never blushes, it never hesitates, it never says, of its own accord, here at the 90th degree, I am not quite to be trusted. It simply hangs there, gleaming and admired, being wrong in silence. The sky behind it cannot be wrong, because the sky is not answering a question. It is not trying to be believed. It is only there, being exactly where it is, with the perfect indifference of the very old. And so a plain honest soul with a poor pocket glass and a bowl of quicksilver, who troubles to ask the sky the same question a second way, and to write down both of the answers, may catch the great brass circle in a lie that the finest mind in England, trusting it, will swear upon his knighthood is the truth. There was a man on the northern moors who had made exactly this his whole religion, and had it beaten out of him for his pains. Check the instrument, he used to say, not the man. Any fool can doubt a stranger's word. It costs him nothing. It takes a workman to doubt a brass circle that 3 learned societies have stood and admired. Doubt the thing that everyone trusts. Go round behind the beautiful answer and ask, humbly and on your knees if need be, whether the beautiful thing that gave it was itself telling the truth, and be prepared when you have done it to be hated for it, because you will have made a whole warm, comfortable room turn and look at the one object in it that not a soul present had thought to suspect. For the world will always believe the great instrument and the great name. It wants to. It is restful, too. A famous man stands up and reads a figure off a gleaming circle, and 200 people write the figure down in their pocketbooks and go home to their dinners entirely satisfied, and not one in the 200 has thought to wonder whether the gleaming circle was cut a hair's breadth wrong at the 90th degree by a tired workman in a shed 30 years before either of them was born. That is the crack in the floor of the world, through which every clever ruin walks in out of the rain. It is a very easy thing to correct a woman. It is very nearly impossible to correct the sun. This, then, is the story of a woman who was called careless, and worse than careless, before the best company in England, in a fine bright room with the commissioners of the crown in it and the newspapers waiting at the door, who was told to her face by a duke that she had corrupted the patient labour of years with a slovenly and untutored hand, and had her wage stopped in the same breath, and her name ordered struck out of the work that she had, in plain fact, very nearly all of her done herself, and who said nothing at all. She said nothing while a famous man swore the fault was hers. She said nothing while the Duke of Sterndale turned his back on her in front of them all. She said nothing for the better part of a year, and let the whole county say of her whatever it found most comfortable to say, and boarded in 2 poor rooms over a saddler's, and did small figuring for a shilling for anyone who brought it to her, and did not once in all that time say the single sentence that would have cleared her name, because she had understood, in the half-second while the famous man was still speaking, that there was only one witness on the whole earth who could be made to prove her right, and that the witness would not be called for 11 weeks, and would keep its appointment to the second whether she was ruined by then or not. She said nothing, and she waited for the sky. Her name was Cassandra Merrick, though no one had called her Cassandra in 20 years, and a good many of the people who spoke of her had never troubled to learn that she owned a Christian name at all. On the Sterndale estate, and in the careful letters of the great man who used her, and at the last in the London prints that made a figure of fun of her, she was only ever the computer, which was, in those days, the trade word for the person who did the sums, who took the raw, naked observations of a night, the bare heights and the bare times, and by hour upon hour of patient reduction, turned them into the clean tabled figures that a gentleman might publish and a sailor might one day steer his ship by. It was reckoned a low sort of work, fit for a clever clerk or a poor relation who must be kept and might as well be useful, the way copying is reckoned low by people who have never once tried to copy 4,000 lines of figures without letting a single error in among them. She had done that work for the Sterndale Observatory for 19 years. And for the last 9 of those years she had done, besides, very nearly all of the observing that the sums were made from, standing the cold, clear nights alone at the great circle, while the famous man slept warm below, because the famous man's eyes were going, and his hand shook on the fine screw, and his temper over both was a thing best not witnessed. This last fact was known to exactly 3 people in the world, and one of the 3 was dead. She was 39. She was plain, in the settled, unarguable way of a woman who has long ago stopped expecting her face to do anything for her, and has turned the whole of her attention outward onto the things that will hold still and be looked at. She had a long, grave face, weather-marked from the nights, steady grey eyes set deep under level brows that had the trick of resting on a thing without any hurry at all, brown hair going quietly iron at the temples, bound back plain under a cap. Her hands were a workman's hands, ink in the cracks of them that no washing would fetch out, and chilblained every winter from the brass. She was quiet in the particular manner of a person who has learned, thoroughly and without self-pity, that nothing she says will be weighed at anything near its true worth, and who has decided in consequence to spend her few words the way a poor woman spends coin, carefully, and only where they will buy something. She owned almost nothing in the world that was truly hers. A change of stuff gowns, a shelf of her dead father's books, most of them mathematical, and all of them worn soft at the corners. A plain calf-bound register in which 19 years of nights stood written in her own small upright hand, every figure of them, and on the flyleaf at the front a short table of numbers that was worth, though nobody yet knew it, more than the whole Sterndale estate. And last, a small brass pocket glass. A star glass, her father had called it, an old traveller's instrument no bigger than a lady's fan, worn silver bright along the arc where his thumb had ridden it for 40 years, with which a patient soul, wanting nothing grander and asking nothing of anybody, could measure the angle between two stars, or between a star and its own bright image lying in a bowl of still quicksilver, and so put the question straight to the sky itself, with no great circle of brass on any wall having the least part in the answer. These two things, the register and the star glass, were the whole of her fortune. They were about to be worth more than everything the Duke of Sterndale owned. And she did not yet know it, and neither that autumn did a living soul besides. The moor stood 2,000 feet above the sea, a great brown shoulder of the world, with the weather going over it in armies, and on the very crown of it, where the old Duke had set it because the air there was the stillest and the darkest in the kingdom, stood the Sterndale Observatory. It was a squat drum of dressed grey stone, with a dome of copper long gone green, and one stone-flagged round room within, and rising up through the middle of the floor, on its own separate pier of masonry that touched no wall anywhere, so that no footfall and no gale that ever blew should shake it by the breadth of a hair, stood the great circle. It was of solid brass, taller than a tall man, and round the whole of its rim a patient workman in a distant city had cut the 360 degrees, and each degree into its minutes, in strokes so fine that they must be read through a glass. And it had cost the old Duke the price of a good farm, and it was admired by every man of science who climbed the moor to see it, and it had been quietly telling a lie at the 90th degree of its arc since before Cassandra Merrick was born. Her father had kept that room for 30 years. Josiah Merrick was a curate's younger son, who had never in his life had £5 together that were his own, and who possessed, in a shabby greatcoat and with no more schooling than the parish gave, one of the 2 or 3 finest observing eyes in England. He could not have made his way in a drawing-room to save his life. He could sit at that eyepiece on a night of hard frost and take the passage of a star across the meridian, over and over, with a steadiness of hand and a patience of attention that the celebrated men who came up in summer could not equal, and did not trouble to hide that they resented. He had married late and buried his wife early, and been left with the one child, and because there was no one else, and because the child had plainly got his own eye, he had bred her to the work from the time she could hold a pen, teaching her the sky the way another man might have taught a son a trade, level and without ornament, and expecting it to bear weight for the whole of her life. And he had taught her the one hard thing that had ruined him. For Josiah Merrick, alone among all the men who ever used that circle, had refused to trust it. It gnawed at him that a thing so admired had never once been proved. And so, over a year of nights that nearly killed him, with a plumb line and a spirit level, and a bowl of still quicksilver and his own daughter holding the lamp, he had asked the sky to check the brass, had taken the height of the same known stars, first upon the great circle, and then a second way, off their own images lying in the mercury, where no circle came into it at all, and had found, and written down, and proved past the possibility of doubt, that the great circle of Sterndale was misdivided near one limb, and read the heavens wrong at that part of its arc by a small, fixed, deadly amount. He made a table of it, degree by degree, the true correction to be applied. It was the finest single piece of work of his life, and it was worth, though no one would believe it, for 30 years, more than everything else on that moor put together. He took it to the old Duke, and to the great consulting name of the day, who was even then Sir Hector Pruitt, and he was overruled, kindly and completely, as a clever, obstinate, self-taught man is overruled by his betters. The circle was perfect. It had cost a fortune, and was admired by 3 societies. The error, if there were an error at all, was in the eye of the man who fancied he had found one. And there the matter would have rested and done no harm, had not the old Duke, some years on, published under his own vain hand a great result worked from that faulty arc, and had the whole of it torn to pieces in 4 minutes before the society, by a rival who had checked it against the plain sky. Someone had to be blamed, and it could not be the Duke, and it could not be the famous consultant, and so it was the poor man who kept the room. Josiah Merrick was named to his face as the careless hand that had corrupted a nobleman's labor. He was turned off. He was made a small, ugly paragraph in the London Prince, and he took a chill on the moor that winter walking home from a thing he could not afford to defend, and did not fight it, and died in the spring in his own bed with his daughter's hand in his, saying only, over and over, that the circle was wrong, and that no one in England would kneel down and look. The young Duke, Miles, newly and unwillingly come to the title, his father a fortnight dead, had ridden up through the sleet when word came, and had found the old man gone and the girl sitting by him dry-eyed, and would not have it that a keeper of 30 years should be carried down off, that fell like a dead sheep. And he had wrapped Josiah Merrick in his own greatcoat, and taken him up before him on the horse, and brought him down himself, and given orders, in a voice that closed the matter, that nothing of the manner of it was ever to be reported. It was the single act of grace in the whole ruin, and Cassandra Merrick, 29 then and past weeping, had watched him do it, and had loved him quietly and hopelessly from that grey afternoon onward, and had never told a living soul, and had never once supposed that anything would come of it, because she was a servant with ink in her hands, and he was the Duke of Sterndale, and she had put the wanting away in the same drawer where she kept the star-glass, and had gone on with the work. The star-glass had come to her off her father's neck the night he died. It was a small brass pocket sextant, an old traveller's instrument no bigger than a lady's fan, worn silver bright along its little arc where his thumb had ridden it for 40 years, and with it, and a bowl of quicksilver. A person who wanted nothing and asked nothing of anybody could measure the sky directly, as he had taught her, and prove the great circle a liar any clear night she chose. She kept it wrapped in a square of flannel in the work-box, and took it out on the bad nights, and did not use it. Because there was no longer any need, she knew the table by heart, applied it to every figure she reduced, and gave the observatory clean, true results year upon year, while the great man's name went out upon them. She was cheap, and she was never wrong, and so she was kept. For 19 years she had been the whole truth of that place, and the name of none of it. The 8th Duke, the old Duke, had been a large, warm, loud, generous, star-struck man who loved the heavens the way some men love horses or the gaming table, ruinously, and without a particle of judgment. He had poured the Sterndale estate up through that copper dome for 20 years, the great circle, the finest glasses money could buy from the continent, the regulator clock in its sealed case, and above all the long, glorious, bottomless chase after the one prize that could crown it. For the crown, in those years, kept standing a great reward, an enormous sum, and a greater glory, for any man who could furnish tables of the moon and the stars exact enough that a captain far out on the blank ocean, with no landmark in the round world, might reckon from them how far east or west of home he stood, and so not pile his ship and all her people onto a shore he had miscounted in the dark. The old Duke had wanted that prize the way his son now wanted nothing at all. He had courted the society, and feasted them, and been flattered by them, and at the very last been laughed at by them. And he had died with the tables unfinished, the prize unwon, and the land mortgaged to its roots, leaving his son a coronet, a mountain of debt, and a name that meant, in every club in London, expensive folly. Miles Sterne had spent the years since turning himself to iron to pay for it. He had sold the horses and shut the London house and let his own youth go by unspent, and had kept the tenants of Sterndale fed and dry through hard seasons by the plain method of keeping himself in harness like one of his own plough horses, and allowing himself to want nothing that could not be entered in a ledger. He hated the observatory on its hill as the beautiful expensive thing that had eaten his father and beggared his people, and he could not close it, because the one stroke that could clear the whole crushing debt at once, and set the estate on its feet, and let him at last be a duke to his tenants, instead of a debtor to his bankers, was the very prize his father had died chasing. And the tables were, after all those years and all that money, very nearly done. So he held his nose and finished it. He retained the most celebrated astronomical name in the kingdom, Sir Hector Pruitt, to bring the Sterndale tables to their conclusion and lay them before the board's commissioners on a day fixed for the following spring, and win the thing and have done. It was, he told himself, a matter of business like draining a wet field, and he rode up to the cold room on the moor as seldom as the business allowed, and did not look at the woman who kept it any more than a man looks at the desk he writes on. He looked at her, the first time, on an afternoon in the back end of that year, because she contradicted the first astronomer in England to his face and saved the Duke of Sterndale from writing his name to a falsehood. Sir Hector had been holding forth. He was always holding forth, laying before the Duke in the rolling voice that filled lecture rooms, some confident grand assurance about what the commissioners would be shown, a claim with a wrong figure at the heart of it, the kind of small proud error a failing man makes when he no longer troubles to check himself, because he cannot any longer imagine that he is wrong. The Duke, who knew no astronomy, and was signing where he was bid, had the pen in his hand, and Cassandra Merrick at her sloped desk in the corner, unasked and unregarded, had said quietly that she begged Sir Hector's pardon, but the figure was not so, and here was the observation it was drawn from, and it would not do to set it before the board, because a plain man on the board would check it, and it would not stand. There had been a silence with a great deal in it. Sir Hector's colour had come up, and he had said something genial and crushing about the enthusiasm of clerks, and the Duke had looked, for the first time in his life, at the plain grey woman in the corner, who had just, at plain risk to her bread, stopped him from making a fool of himself in front of the Crown, and had asked her, coolly, whether she was quite sure. And she had said that she was. Not defiantly, and not humbly either. She had simply said that she was sure, and had turned the register round on the desk so that the thing might be looked at by anyone who cared to look. "You do not soften it," he had said to her, half an accusation. "Softening it would not make it true, Your Grace," she had answered. And Your Grace would still have signed it, and he had put the pen down, and had the figure struck, and had ridden back down the moor, turning over in his mind, against his will, the recollection that this was the daughter of the man he had carried down the fell, and that she was the only creature on the whole estate who had ever told him a thing that cost her something to say. He did not know yet that she was right about a great deal more than one figure. Neither did she know that the crack she had learned by heart at her father's knee was about, that very winter, to run clean across all their lives. The trouble came to a head over the moon. For the tables that were to win the prize, the great labor of that winter was the place of the moon, her exact path among the stars, night after night, month after month, because it is by the moon, that one swift near body sliding visibly against the fixed lamps behind her, that a captain far out at sea can be brought to know his longitude, if only the tables in his chest are true enough. And the moon's place was taken on the great circle, as the star places were, and so the moon's place, in the raw, carried the great circle's lie folded into it, at exactly that part of the arc where the moon rode highest. Cassandra Merrick had been quietly mending that lie for 19 years. She applied her father's table to every figure she reduced, without a word, the way a careful cook takes the bone out of a fish before it is set before a guest, and the observatory's results went out clean and true, and no one ever asked her why they were good. She had supposed she would go on doing it, unnoticed and unthanked, until she died. But the prize tables were not to be an ordinary year's work quietly reduced in a corner. They were to be examined, and the whole method of them printed and defended before the board, every step of the reduction laid open, and so Sir Hector Pruitt that winter, for the first time in years, actually read through the reductions with a critical eye, and found in them a correction he had not sanctioned, applied degree by degree to the moon's high places. That made a plain nonsense of a perfectly good instrument, and that came, when he ran it to its root, from a table in the dead keeper's hand that he had himself ruled out of court 30 years before. He was very angry, in his large, genial way, which was worse than another man's shouting. He struck the whole of it out. He would not have it said, before the commissioners of the crown, that the famous Sterndale circle which he had passed, and praised and staked his name upon for a generation, was a mismade thing that a servant had been secretly nursing along behind his back. It was not to be endured. It was not to be true. And a man does not at 55 overturn the ruling of his prime at the word of the woman who rules his register. He ordered the tables recomputed from the raw circle, his way, with no correction at all, and he told her, kindly, that her father's obstinacy had done harm enough in its day without being handed down like a family plate. She warned him. She did it plainly, and once, as her father would have, standing at the desk with the register open at the flyleaf where the table was, she told him that the circle was wrong at that limb, that she could prove it any clear night with a bowl of quicksilver and a glass a man could put in his pocket, that the tables computed his way would be wrong by a small fixed amount that did not matter in a drawing room, and would matter terribly on the sea, and that men steering by them in the dark would be set down miles from where the figures swore they stood, and would strike and drown. She said it levelly, wanting nothing, telling a true thing because a true thing was there to be told. And Sir Hector Pruitt looked at her the way the whole of her life had taught her men would look at her, and said that he would thank the person who ruled his lines to leave the reckoning of the heavens to those who had been trained to it, and to rule the figures she was given, and keep her opinions for her aunt. And he had the tables done his way, and she did them, because it was that or be turned off that week, and her aunt with her, and because she had already begun to see the shape of a colder and more patient way to be right. For she kept her own register too. Every figure she was made to compute to his false assumption she also computed truly, in the calf-bound book that was her own, and set the two side by side and dated them, so that there existed, in her hand, month upon month, the plain record of exactly how far his tables departed from the truth, and exactly why. It was worth nothing at all, that book, to anyone who trusted the great circle and the great name. It would be worth everything to anyone, some day, who would kneel down and look. The Duke came up to the observatory once that winter, at an hour he was not expected, near midnight, riding up on a state business that could as easily have waited for morning, though he did not examine too closely why it could not, and found the famous consultant long abed below, and the plain grey woman alone at the eyepiece in a man's greatcoat and her father's shawl, taking the moon in the bitter cold with a stone-hot bottle at her feet, and her breath smoking in the lamplight. He stood in the doorway a while and watched her work. The economy of it, the stillness, the way she wrote without looking at the page, and something in him that had been shut for years shifted a little, the way a house shifts in a thaw. He asked her at last why she did the night work when there was a knighted astronomer sleeping warm below who was paid to do it. She did not tell him the truth, that the knighted astronomer could no longer see the wire and would not own it. She said only that the nights were fine and she did not mind them, and that the moon would not wait on anyone's convenience. And he heard, under the plain answer, the whole shape of a loyalty that was protecting a man who did not deserve it. And he did not understand it, and he went away disturbed. He noticed, going, the little brass glass on its cord laid by her hand on the desk, and asked what it was, and she said it had been her father's. and he did not press her, and rode down the moor in the cold with the picture of her at the eyepiece, staying with him longer than it had any business to. The commissioners came up to Sterndale in the spring. They came to see the great tables presented, and the method defended, a grave, courteous party of them, men of the society and 2 plain examiners of the practical sort who had been to sea. And among the practical men, broad and grizzled and out of place in that gilded company as a capstan in a drawing-room, came Captain Josiah Redruth, who had spent 30 years keeping ships off the rocks by dead reckoning and the grace of God, and who had that very winter, on an advance proof of the Sterndale moon tables circulated to the ports for trial, worked his longitude coming up channel in thick weather, and been set by the figures a clear 12 miles to the east of where his ship in fact swam, and had come within the singing of the leadsman and 1 lucky rift in the fog of laying his vessel and 11 living men on a lee shore in the dark. He had not come up the moor to admire anybody. He had come to find out why the numbers a nobleman's astronomer had put his name to had very nearly killed him and his crew, and he asked it, in the middle of the fine presentation, in a quarter-deck voice that stopped the room, with the proof-sheet in his fist. These tables put me 12 mile wrong on a night I could not spare a cable's length. How? And there it was, in 1 instant, in front of the commissioners of the Crown and the newspapers waiting below, the error, real, public, and past smoothing, the prize in mortal peril, and the name of Sterndale about to be a byword for the 2nd time in 1 generation. Sir Hector Pruitt did not hesitate the length of a breath. It is the thing Cassandra Merrick understood about him in that moment, and never afterward doubted, that a man may hold the first place in England for learning and have, at the bottom of him where the courage should be, nothing at all. He turned, genial, grave, wounded, magnificent, and he laid the whole of it, in 3 unhurried sentences, upon the woman at the desk in the corner. The reductions, he said, had unhappily been entrusted, these many years in the late Duke's too easy day, to a person of no training whatever, the daughter of a keeper once turned off for the very same fault. That he had that winter discovered her tampering with the figures upon a crank notion of her dead father's, and had corrected it as far as the time allowed, and that the corruption the good captain had so rightly caught was hers, root and branch. The same careless, untutored hand that had cost the house once already. He was sorry for it. He said he was very sorry for it. He said it looking at her with a kind of sorrow on his big, handsome face, and every eye in the room followed his to her. And the Duke of Sterndale, with a second ruin opening under his feet and the prize that was to save his people sliding away, and the famous man he had staked everything on offering him, in that unbearable moment, 1 single plank to stand on, that the fault was not in the great expensive instrument, and not in the great expensive name, but in a servant who could be turned off before dinner. Took the plank. He turned to her, his face gone to stone, and he asked her 1 question, and only 1. He asked her whether the reductions were in her hand. They were. She had made them, every figure, that winter, to Sir Hector's forced assumption under protest, having warned him to his face that they were false. The truthful answer to the question he had asked was 1 word, and it was the word that would hang her, and she gave it, because she had never in her life given any other kind, and because some cold, steady thing in her had already understood that a lie now would cost her the only ground she would ever have to stand on. Yes. she said. And the room broke before she could say the other 11 words, the words that would have told them whose figure she had worked to, and who had overruled the warning, and where in that very desk the true register lay that proved it. The one word was enough for them. It was what they wished to hear. A servant had confessed. The instrument was clean, the great man was clean, the house was saved, and there was a careless woman to carry it all away out of the bright room on her own back. The Duke did not ask the second question. He never asked whose assumption the false tables were computed to, or who had struck out the true correction, or why a woman who had just destroyed herself with one honest word would have troubled to lie about any of the rest. He turned his back on her, physically, deliberately, so that the room saw him do it, and he said, in the level, courteous voice that was the worst thing she had ever heard, that her wage was stopped from that day, that her name was to be struck from every sheet of the work, and that she would be gone from Sterndale land by morning. Then he gave his attention to the commissioners, and to the saving of what could be saved, and left her to gather her book and her glass and go. She went. She said nothing more at all. And walking down off that moor in the dusk with the register wrapped in her shawl, she was already reckoning, in the cold, clear part of her mind, that grief had never once been able to reach, that the sun would be darkened over England in the autumn, that she had long ago computed both predictions of it, Sir Hector's and her own, and that they differed by a measurable stretch of minutes, that the sky would keep the one and not the other, before witnesses, whether she was ruined by then or not, and that if she said a single word of any of this tonight, the great circle would be quietly filed true, and her register quietly burned, and the one witness on earth that could not be bought would be robbed of the only proof that made it speak. So she would not say the word. She would carry the whole weight of it, in silence, into the autumn, and let them think what they liked, and wait for the sky. She took 2 poor rooms over a saddler's in the town at the foot of the moor, and lived in them, that long summer, on almost nothing. She had her aunt to keep, Deborah Merrick, her father's elder sister, 68 and near blind these 6 years, with a milky film across both eyes and a tongue that had lost none of its edge to the dark, and she kept them both by doing small figuring for whoever brought it, a shopkeeper's accounts, a builder's estimate, the tonnage of a barge, done neatly and quickly at the window for a few pence, by a hand that had reduced the place of the moon for 19 years. It was a very great fall, and she did not appear to feel it, which the town found provoking. A woman who wept, or who protested, or who fled, they would have known how to pity or to blame. A woman who simply sat at her window and did their sums correctly and said nothing gave them nothing to take hold of, and so they made up what they wanted, and said it, and she let them. The London prince did worse and did it in pictures. Some artist, who had never been within 100 miles of the moor, produced a thing that sold very well in the shops of the Strand. A bent hag at a great circle, pen in her claw, a ship going on to black rocks in the corner of it, and a line of verse beneath about the Duke's computer, who cast the stars so ill she cast a crew away. It was described to Deborah Merrick, who could not see it, by a neighbor who thought to be kind, and the old woman made them read the verse to her twice, and then laughed until she had to be thumped on the back. They've drawn you with a wart. Gel, she said, wheezing, groping for her niece's ink-stained hand and holding it. You've never had a wart in your life. There's their scholarship for you. Can't get a wart right at a foot's distance and they'll tell the world where the moon stands. Let them. The sky's coming, and the sky can't read. It did Cassandra more good than a year of gentler comfort could have done. It was, in fact, the exact truth put where she could bear to look at it. For the sky was coming, and that was the whole of what she held to. But there was a thing in the holding that near unmade her, and it was not her own ruin at all. She had put that down early, and did not pick it up again. It was the ships. The tables computed Sir Hector's way were not going to stay in a drawer at Sterndale. They were to be printed, and sold, and put into the sea chests of men like Captain Redruth up and down the kingdom, who would trust them in the dark because a nobleman's astronomer had sworn to them, and some of those men, on some thick night, with a lee shore under them, would be set 12 miles wrong by a figure she could have made true, and would strike, and their people would drown, holding tables with a lie folded into them at the 90th degree. She could stop it. Tonight, with one letter, and she made herself see again and again through that summer, in the cold, clear part of her that grief could not reach, that she could not, that a letter tonight would be read as a turned-off servant's spite, that the great man would answer it in a morning and have the circle quietly filed true and her register quietly into the fire, that the tables would go out over his unshaken name regardless, and that she would have spent for nothing the one proof that could ever stop them for good. To save the ships she had to let the danger stand until the sky could be made to testify to it in front of the men who published the tables. It was the hardest sum she ever did, and she did it right, and it cost her more than all the rest. There was one night she did not do it right, and it was the worst of them, and it is the one she never afterward spoke of. It was near 2 a.m, in the black middle of that summer, and she took her father's hammer, the plain iron-shod observing hammer he had carried up the moor for 30 years, that had come to her with the glass and the books, and she walked up the moor in the dark, 4 miles to the observatory that was no longer hers to enter, and let herself in with the key that no one had ever thought to ask her to give back, and stood over the great circle in the starlight with the hammer in both her hands. She could end it here. She could break the lying thing across its faulty limb so that it should never send another ship onto the rocks. She could take that much, at least, out of the world's power to do harm. She stood there a long time. And then she put the hammer down on the stone floor, very quietly, because she had understood, even at the bottom of that night, that a broken circle proves nothing at all, that they would say only that the mad, turned-off woman had crept up and smashed the instrument out of spite, which would damn her father's memory a second time, and leave the false tables standing exactly as they were, and that a whole circle, left alone to be caught lying by the sun in front of the crown, proves everything. She left the hammer where it lay. She locked the door behind her and walked the 4 miles down again in the growing light, empty-handed and dry-eyed and steadier than she had been in weeks, and she waited. The work would not come right without her, and that was what turned it. All that summer, while she sat at her window doing sums for pennies, the great tables at Sterndale went on failing. Captain Redruth would not let it alone, He was not a man who could be made to see reason by rank, having spent his life among things, rocks, tides, the set of a current, that were entirely indifferent to a man's title. And he wrote flat, ugly, unanswerable letters to the board, asking how the first astronomer of the age had put his name to figures that put an honest ship 12 miles wrong, and whether the great Sterndale Circle had ever once in all its admired existence been checked against the plain sky. Other reports came in from other ports, quiet, damning, all the same way. The commissioners deferred the prize, pending an inquiry. And Sir Hector Pruitt produced correction after correction, each grander and more confident than the last, and not one of them made the tables agree with the sea, because you cannot mend a wrong answer by adding more wrong answers to it. You can only mend it by going back to the one true measure that everyone had agreed, years before, not to make. Miles Stern sat with the failing work through the short summer nights, and began, slowly and against the whole grain of his need to doubt. He was not a scientific man, but he was a careful one, and a careful man cannot forever unsee a pattern once it has begun to show through. The results of that observatory had been right, plainly, reliably, boringly right, for 19 years, and had gone wrong, catastrophically and all at once, in exactly the one winter he had let the famous man strike out a correction that had always, before, been quietly applied. The corruption everyone was blaming on a careless woman had begun on the precise day that woman's careful hand had been overruled. His mother said a thing to him, once, at dinner, having never for a moment believed the grey daughter of the man carried down the fell to be careless of anything. You turned your back, Miles, on the only person in that room who answered you against her own interest, and you kept your face to the only one who answered you in his. I wonder that a man so proud of his judgment was so easy to please. He did not answer her. He rode up to the observatory that night and took down the register that was left, the official one, and read the reductions of that winter with a candle until it guttered, and saw at last with his own eyes that the failing tables were computed to one assumption, and the good years to another, and that the hand was the same hand in both, that she had not blundered, but obeyed, that the change was not a fault creeping in, but a truth struck out, and that he had asked her, in the bright room, exactly one question, and it had not been the right one. He went down to the town the next morning and climbed the stair over the saddlers and knocked on her door, and when she opened it he did the thing that was still, even then, in his blood to do, and it was the wrong thing. He came as a duke whose work was failing, and he told her, courteously and levelly, that there had plainly been some confusion over the reductions, and that he required her to come back up to Sterndale and set the tables right before the inquiry sat. He offered her wages. He did not say that he had wronged her. He did not ask her a question of any kind. He came to use the true hand again, having broken it in public, as though a thing may be picked up as easily as it was put down. And Cassandra Merrick looked at him standing on her poor landing in his fine coat, offering to hire back the woman he had turned his back on, and she said, without heat, that she was very sorry, but she was engaged in doing sums for the town at present, and could not oblige him, and she shut the door. Quietly in the face of the Duke of Sterndale, and behind it her aunt said, "To the room, that's my girl," and went on knitting in the dark. He stood on the landing a while. Then he went away, and Deborah Merrick, who could hear a great deal more than she could see, remarked that he had gone down the stairs slowly, like a man carrying something, and that a man who went down slowly would very likely come up again. He came back that same night. He came without the horse and without the fine manner, on foot up the dark stair, and when she opened the door he was turning his hat round and round in his 2 hands like a farmer, and he did not offer her wages, and he did not tell her what he required. He asked her a question. He asked her whose assumption the false tables had been computed to, and who had struck out the correction, and why she had let one honest word in a bright room ruin her sooner than say the rest. And then, before she could answer any of it, he asked the only question that mattered, the one he should have asked in the spring, the second question that his whole rank and his whole fear had kept him from asking for months while an innocent woman carried the weight of it down a moor in the dark. He asked her whether she would show him. She would show him. But she would not tell him, and the difference between the two was the whole of what her father had left her, and she meant the Duke of Sterndale to learn it the only way it can be learned, which is on your own knees, with your own eye, at your own instrument, in the cold. They went up the moor together on the next clear night, which was 3 nights on she would not be hurried, and a working astronomer takes the sky gives, and not the one she would prefer. And she lit the lamp in the cold stone room, and did not say one word about the great circle being wrong. She would not give him a conclusion to believe or to doubt. She gave him a task. She named him a star, a bright known star, that would come that night nearly overhead, riding the very part of the arc where the trouble lived. And she set him at the eyepiece, a duke in his shirt-sleeves on an observer's stool at midnight, and she taught his cold hands the fine screw, and made him wait out the long, slow minutes until the star came down onto the wire, and take its height himself upon the great admired circle of Sterndale, and read the figure off the brass through the glass, and write it down in his own hand. He did it. He was clumsy and then less clumsy, and there was a plain grim pleasure in his face at having done a real thing with his hands for once, instead of signing his name under another man's. And he read off the figure, and it was a good figure, clean and confident, exactly the sort of figure 200 people write in their pocketbooks, and go down to dinner satisfied. Then she took the little brass glass out of its flannel, her father's star glass, and she set a shallow bowl of quicksilver on the flags in the lamplight, still and black and holding the star in it like a second sky laid on the floor. And she taught his hands the glass, and had him measure the very same star a second way, the star above against its own image below, the angle between them, which any traveller could take on any hillside with a thing he carried in his coat, and which no circle on any wall came into at all. She had him do it 3 times, until he had it clean. She had him halve it, on the slate himself, and she set the 2 figures side by side in the lamplight, the height the great circle had given, and the height the pocket glass and the sky had given. And she said nothing whatever, and let the Duke of Sterndale look at the gap between them with his own eyes. There was a gap. It was small. It was deadly. And when he looked from the 2 figures, not understanding yet, to her face, she opened the calf-bound register to the flyleaf, to her father's table in her father's hand, dated the year the Duke was a boy, and put her finger on the one line of it that gave the error of the circle at that degree of the arc, and the number written there, 30 years old, was the gap between his 2 figures to the last place. not near it. The dead keeper had written down, a generation before, exactly by how much the admired circle would lie to the Duke of Sterndale on this particular night at this particular star, and it had lied by precisely that, and the proof of it was lying in a bowl of mercury on the floor of the man's own observatory, and had been there for the asking every clear night for 30 years, and not one soul had ever knelt down and looked. He was a long time silent. Then, because he was after all a careful man, and would have the whole of it or none, he asked to see the fault itself. And she was glad of him for asking, because it was the last thing her father had begged for, and never got. She set the lamp low, and laid a spirit level along the brass, and brought his eye down close to the rim at the 90th degree, where the finest strokes were cut, and let him see with his own eye the thing no admiring glance from 6 feet away had ever caught, that there, and only there, the divisions crowded, leaned a hair together, the strokes of a patient workman, whose hand had at last grown tired at the end of a long day's cutting in a bad light, in a shed in a distant city 30 years before, so that the degrees in that quarter were a shade too narrow, and the circle read a shade too high, and had gone on reading a shade too high, in the same confident, elegant, unhesitating voice, every night since. A hair of a tired man's weariness, cut into brass, sent out over the years into the sea chests of captains as truth. He looked at it for a long time. When he straightened up, his face had changed in a way she had not seen a man's face change before, and he said, very low, that his father had died being told this, and had not been able to make anyone kneel down, and she said, mine too. And for a moment the two of them stood in the cold dome on the two opposite sides of one grief, and were, without a word said about it, no longer a duke and a computer at all, but only two people who had each been left a true thing by a ruined father and had spent their lives being disbelieved about it. He asked her then the question a decent man cannot help asking, and it undid him more than the brass had, why in God's name she had not simply told him this in the spring, and spared herself the whole horror of the summer. And she told him the cold truth of it, levelly, wanting nothing, the way she told all her truths. Because he would not have believed her, and she had no way then to make him. The sky had not yet come round to say it, because the moment she named the fault, Sir Hector would have had the circle quietly filed true and this register quietly burned, and the proof gone, and the false tables gone out to sea over his unshaken name regardless, and men drowned by them, and no one ever the wiser. Because a servant's word against the first astronomer in England is worth nothing, and a bowl of quicksilver on a public day in front of the commissioners of the crown is worth everything, and the difference between the two was 11 weeks of the calendar, and one solar eclipse that she had computed both ways, and knew the sky would settle in her favor before witnesses. She had not been enduring, she said. She had been waiting for a better court to sit. It only looked, from the outside, like the same thing. He wanted to proclaim it that night, to ride down and wake the commissioners, produce the register, break the great man before breakfast. She would not have it. And here at last, the power in the room had wholly changed hands, and both of them knew it, and neither remarked on it. She, who had begun the winter as the furniture, now set the terms, and the Duke of Sterndale took them. No, she said, not the register, not tonight, not her word against his. If they moved now, Sir Hector would find a form of words, and blur it, and the tables would still creep out to sea under the great blur of his authority, and somewhere a ship would still strike. It had to be the sun. It had to be in the bright room, in front of the very men who would publish the tables, on the one day when the great man could be got to stake everything on his own false figure, out loud and in advance, and then be contradicted, not by a woman, but by the sky, which he could not sack, and could not answer, and could not out-talk. Let him keep his glory 11 weeks more. Let him stand up on the day of the eclipse and tell the crown to the minute when the sun would fail. And let the sun keep her appointment, and not his, in front of them all. The day of the eclipse came in clear, which was itself a kind of mercy, for a clouded sky would have settled nothing and sent them all home to argue for another year. The whole of the great world that cared for such things came up to Sterndale to see the sun fail. The commissioners of the crown in their gravity, the men of the society, the county in its carriages, and, planted broad and unfashionable in the front of them, with a chronometer in his fist, and no more awe of a duke than of a dogfish, Captain Josiah Redruth, come to watch the tables that had nearly drowned him be tried at last by the only authority he had ever wholly trusted. The observatory could not hold a tenth of them, and so the great instrument's own long telescope had been carried down and set up in the long south room of the house, where the light came in a wall of tall windows, and its image thrown, for no eye can bear the naked sun, upon a broad screen of white paper set up in the shade, so that the disk of the sun lay there before them all, a foot across and calm, for 200 people to watch together in a bright room. Somewhere at the back of that room, plain and grey and unremarked in a borrowed chair, brought up quietly by the Duke's own order and named to no one, sat Cassandra Merrick, with her father's glass in her lap and her register under her hands, and said nothing, and waited, as she had waited all summer, for her one witness to be called. Sir Hector Pruitt was magnificent that morning. The inquiry had stalled for want of the woman to hang it on. The summer's failures had been folded away into talk of the difficulties of a great work. He was restored and expansive, and he stood before the crown and the county and told them, in the rolling voice that filled the room without effort, exactly when the sun would fail. He named the minute of first contact. He named, with especial pride, the very instant at which the dark moon would ride centered upon the sun, and leave standing all round it that thin ring of fire which is the wonder of such a day, and told them it would form at such a moment, and hold for its little span, and pass. And he laid it all upon the famous Sterndale tables and the famous Sterndale circle, as upon his own honour, which by then he could no longer tell apart from either. And here the Duke of Sterndale, who had said very little all morning, said the one thing that hanged him. He asked Sir Hector, courteously, before the commissioners, and before the sun should decide anything, to state plainly and for the record the correction he had applied to the great circle in arriving at these predictions, and the sense in which he had applied it, and his reason, so that the board, he said mildly, might have the whole of the method on paper, whatever the day should bring. It was a reasonable request from a patron, and a vain man cannot refuse to explain his own cleverness before an audience, and so Sir Hector, flattered, unsuspecting, named the exact quantity by which he had ruled that the circle should be adjusted, and the direction, and the confident wrong theory it rested on, all of it entered down by the board's clerk in a fair hand, while 200 people listened, and Cassandra Merrick at the back closed her eyes for one moment, because it was the number off the fly leaf of her register with its sign reversed, the true fault doubled, and set out loud upon the record by the only man who could have known it to name it, 11 weeks after she had let him keep the freedom to do it. Then there was nothing left for anyone to do but watch the sun. It should have begun, by Sir Hector's minute, at a stroke of the clock that came and passed, with the disk on the white screen lying whole and round and unbitten, perfect, untouched. A little rustle went through the room. He said something easy about the difficulty of catching the very first contact. And then, a run of minutes later, at the minute Cassandra Merrick had written down in the spring, and told no one but a duke in a cold dome, the first small blackness crept in upon the sun's western edge, exact, and every chronometer in the room was looked at, and Captain Redruth read his aloud in a voice like a gun, and it was her minute, to the beat, and not the great man's at all. The room understood slowly, and then all at once, but it was the ring that broke him, because the ring cannot be argued with. On the great table's reckoning the dark moon should have stood centered, and the ring of fire closed round it, at Sir Hector's proud instant, and that instant came, and the screen showed only a fat lopsided crescent, the moon still riding wide of center, no ring at all, nothing, and the great man's voice, for the first time in 50 years, had nothing to put into the silence. And the minutes went by with the crescent thinning, and then, at the other instant, the one computed from a bowl of quicksilver and a dead keeper's honest table, and set down months before, in a woman's small upright hand, the moon slid home dead center of the sun before their eyes, and the ring of fire closed all round it, entire, perfect, unmistakable, and held. And 200 watches came up together, and 200 people read the same instant off them, and it was hers. The sky had kept her appointment to the minute in front of the commissioners of the crown, and had missed the first astronomer of the age by the exact amount of his own stated correction, in the exact direction his own stated theory required, so that the sun itself, calm and enormous, on a sheet of white paper in a bright room, stood there pointing at his error for anyone who could add. Captain Redruth, who could add, and who had a professional interest in the matter of ships, got up without asking anyone's leave, and took the little brass star-glass that the plain grey woman at the back held out to him without a word, and a bowl of the quicksilver, and there in the sunlight measured for himself the height of the ringed sun above the true level, and set it against what the great circle said, and reported the difference to the room in the flat voice he would have used to report a sounding, and it was once again the number on the flyleaf, the thing the dead keeper had sworn to and been broken for. There was no arguing left. You cannot out-talk the sun, and you cannot bribe a chronometer, and you cannot sack a bowl of mercury, and Sir Hector Pruitt, who had ruined 2 honest people rather than kneel down and look, stood in the wreck of his own stated figure with the whole learned world doing the sum he had handed them, and said, at the last, nothing at all, which was the only true thing he had contributed to the science of that day. The Duke of Sterndale closed it in 4 sentences, standing before witnesses, and took care that they were the right 4. He said that the fault was in the circle, as the keeper Josiah Merrick had proved 30 years before and been disgraced for proving, He said that the true tables computed to the true correction were the work of Cassandra Merrick, and had been these 19 years, and would go to the board under her name. He said that the woman this house had called careless had alone kept a ship's worth of men from the bottom of the sea by refusing, at ruinous cost to herself, to let a comfortable lie go quietly out upon the water. And he said, last, looking not at the company, but at the grey woman rising from the borrowed chair at the back of his own long room, that the failure of judgment in the spring had been his, entirely and before them all, and that he would be obliged if the record would say so. Then he went down the length of the room through the whole turned and staring company, and he did not take her hand, because he had not yet earned it, but he stood in front of her and bowed to her plainly, as one person bows to another, and she inclined her head to him the exact same measured degree, and neither of them, then or ever, made a scene of it. The rest followed as the true things follow, quietly, once the sky has spoken. The board recalled the proof tables from the ports before another captain could steer by them, and the false sheets were burned, which was the only part of the whole business that made Cassandra Merrick glad in the plain, uncomplicated way a person is glad of a fire in winter, because it meant that the ships were safe now, and that no one would drown holding her name and a lie. The great prize, when the true tables were laid before the commissioners, computed to the true correction, checked against the sun before the Crown's own eyes, was awarded to Sterndale after all, and cleared the mortgage to the last penny, and set the estate on its feet, so that Miles Sterne was at last a duke to his tenants, and not a debtor to his bankers, and he was scrupulous, to the point of grimness, that every sheet of it went out under the name of Merrick, and that the old wrong of 30 years was undone on the same page as the new one, so that Josiah Merrick, who had died on the moor saying the circle was wrong and no one would kneel and look, was written back into the honor of it, posthumously and immovably, by the sun itself. His daughter read that page many times. It was the thing she had wanted, in the end more than any vindication of her own, to have her father proved, in ink that could not be got out again. And the Duke of Sterndale did not, whatever the county confidently expected, get her cheaply, or quickly, or as a reward he might bestow upon himself for having at last done right. He offered her, first not his hand but her father's place, the keepership of the observatory, in her own name, with a proper wage and the whole authority of the room, the post she had done the work of for 19 years and never been permitted to hold. And she took the work, and only the work, and made him understand, without a scene, that the work was not a courtship, and was not to be confused with one. He accepted that. It was the first thing he did that truly moved her, that he could be told no, and hear it, and not sulk, and not press, and simply leave the thing alone. He came up the moor after that as often as a duke decently could, and she contradicted him, on figures and on a good deal besides, whenever he was wrong, which was often, and he learned slowly, against the whole iron grain of a proud and frightened man, to be contradicted by her, and to like it, because he had discovered the rarest thing a man in his position can discover, which is one person in the world who wants nothing from him, and will therefore always tell him the truth. That was the courtship. It went on the better part of 2 years, and consisted very largely of a plain woman correcting a duke, and a duke being glad of it, and it was to the two people conducting it entirely satisfactory, and to Deborah Merrick, who followed the whole of it by ear from her chair, a source of the deepest and most vocal enjoyment. "He's up the moor again," she would say, hearing the horse. "That's the third time this week. Reckon he's got another figure once doubting." And once near the end of it, having listened to her niece come in quiet and glad from a long cold night at the instrument with the Duke of Sterndale carrying the lamp, "You'll have him, then, and Cassandra. After a while, I believe I will, Aunt, about time," said the old woman, comfortably into the dark. "The sky told you 2 years since. You always were slow to trust a first observation." He asked her when he did ask her at last, in the place it was only right that he should ask her, up in the cold dome on a clear night, in his shirt-sleeves as she had first truly seen him, with the great mended circle turning its true face to the stars, and her father's little brass glass warm from her hand between them. He did not make her a grand speech. He had learned better. He asked her plainly, as one person asks another, whether she would have him, knowing exactly what she was, knowing that she would go on telling him the truth whether he liked it or no, and knowing that this was the whole of why he could not do without her. And she took her time, and looked at him steadily in the starlight, the way she looked at everything, without hurry, resting her attention on the thing until she was sure of it, and then she said that she would. And she measured him, in her own mind, as she said it, against the one standard she had ever fully trusted, and found that he came round, at last, to the truth, the way the sky had come round to her in front of them all, not early to flatter, and not too late to matter, but at the appointed minute, which is the only honest time there is. They were married on the moor in the autumn, without much company, and the Dowager Duchess, who had never for one instant believed the grey daughter of the man carried down the fell to be careless of anything, sat very straight through it with her stick planted before her and her verdict, for once entirely satisfied, and said afterward to her son only, "You were nearly a great fool, Miles," which from her was a blessing, and he took it as one. And Cassandra Merrick, that was Duchess of Sterndale before she died, and never once in all her years let anyone call her careless again, kept the keepership of the observatory to the end of her long life, and did the work, and trained the hands that came after her to her father's one hard creed: check the instrument, not the man. Doubt the admired thing. Kneel down and look, and kept the little star-glass in her work-box, worn silver bright along its arc where 2 thumbs now had ridden it, and took it out on the bad nights, and did not, any longer, need it. For the truth of the whole matter was the plain thing the old indifferent face of the sky had been saying all along to anyone who would keep still and listen. The world will always believe the great instrument in the great name. It is restful too, and it costs nothing, and it is wrong perhaps once in a generation in a way that drowns people. It is a very easy thing to correct a woman. It is nearly impossible to correct the sun. And once in a long age, when some patient unregarded soul has troubled to ask the sky the question twice, and to write down both of the answers truly, and to keep the worthless seeming record of it through every temptation to break it or burn it or trade it early for peace, then the great name is made to stand up and state its figure out loud, and the sun comes on, calm and enormous and entirely indifferent to rank, and keeps the appointment it was always going to keep, and the whole bright room is left holding its watches and doing the sum. Cassandra Merrick had asked the sky the question twice. She had written down both of the answers truly. She had never once in her life set down a figure that was not so, and she had carried a true thing through a year of ruin sooner than spend it early on a room that would not yet believe her. And the sky, which cannot be flattered and cannot be frightened, kept her appointment to the minute. Wherever you are keeping this night, under whatever sky, in whatever city's lamplight, however far east or west of this cold moor you are counting the hours, if her long patience has stayed with you, we should love to know the name of the place you are listening from, and what this story stirred in you, and if it moved you at all, stay near and softly for the next one. His grace and her quiet will keep its own appointment, and come round to you again.